My dear friends, good day. You might be a big movie fan like me, and one of the things I love in some adventure or action movies is the moment when one of the protagonists sacrifices himself for a good cause with epic music, filmed in slow-mo, while taking a last look at his friends, meaning, remember me, or I love you guys, or we had a good time. Well, today I'm going to take a look back together at three guys who decided to go out with a bang. Pirates, knights of the 100 Years' War, in short, protagonists with decidedly heroic deaths that would almost bring a tear to your eye. Almost. We all know how to stub our toe on a coffee table and end up feeling like a fool for such a thing. Because on the other hand, there are some who don't take into account a lost leg, if not two, and a torn-off arm. Well, not many either. But I know two like that. There's the Black Knight from the Holy Grail and Aristide Aubert from Petit Thouars. The Aubert du Petit Thouars family from Tours, ennobled in 1714, is a military family. That is why, out of the four sons of Gilles Louis Antoine, captain of the regiment of Rouergue, at least two are sent to the military college of La Flèche in La Sarthe. Louis-Marie, born in 1758, who will become a famous botanist, and the intrepid Aristide, born in 1760. Both young boys are fascinated by the adventures of Robinson Crusoe, but of the two, Aristide is the more daring one, who dreams more than anything else of sailing the seas of the world. So much so that he tries to run away with a friend at the age of 9 to embark as a ship's boy in Nantes, before being brought back to school by the skin of his bum. But the desire to join the Navy is now well anchored in the head of young Aristide. A little too much, as we shall see. But for the moment, he goes to the military school in Paris, a little far from the sea, and is destined to the infantry. He's clearly not keen, but since the reforms of the moment don't include a position in the Navy, he ends up in the regiment of Poitou. Yeah, so much fun! But hey, he hasn't said his last word. In 1776, the famous navigator and explorer James Cook announces a third expedition. Aristide, 16 years old, immediately volunteers. But no luck. He is not selected. Well, he can still console himself a few years later, probably by learning that during his trip, Cook ends up being beaten to death by a Hawaiian tribe. Nevertheless, for the time being, Aristide was condemned to stay on land. That said, considering the death that awaited him, perhaps it was better to be beaten by the Hawaiian tribe. His luck finally arrives with the American War of Independence, which opposes at first, from 1775, the American colonists against the British. And when it comes to pissing off the British, nobody is stronger than France. In 1778, the France of the young Louis XVI joined the colonists to fight against British imperialism. With this declaration of war, Aristide, 18 years old, rushes to Rochefort, where one of the biggest arsenals in France is located, passes his exam, and can finally embark on a ship, the Fendant, as an apprentice officer. On board the Fendant, the young and reckless Tourangeau participated in many battles on the Atlantic, whether in Brittany, Senegal, or the West Indies, where he learned his trade, never sparing himself until 1782. We then see him survey the Mediterranean, the English Channel, the Sea of Marmara between Anatolia and the Balkans to perfect his knowledge. We don't really know what he did at the beginning of the Revolution, but being a nobleman and an officer on the one hand, and having participated in the American War of Independence on the other, he slipped through the cracks to the point that he was promoted to lieutenant in 1792. I'll skip the details of his tumultuous life and simply summarize that he had some problems with the revolutionaries and decided to go into exile during the Terror. He comes back in 1795, and for a former aristocrat, he's rather well received since he is made captain of the Tonon, a warship of 80 guns. And it is on board that he will enter history. At the beginning of 1796, a young Corsican officer, the future Napoleon Bonaparte, becomes the general-in-chief of the Army of the Interior before being put at the head of a small army to open a diversionary front against the Austrians in Italy. This is the beginning of the famous Italian campaign, where he clearly exceeds his objectives, beating the Austrians 5 times in a row while being inferior in numbers. He returned to Paris victorious in 1797, and that makes Napoleon very popular. Too much so. As a result, the 5-man board of directors that now runs the government decides to keep him out of politics for a while, accepting his plan to invade Egypt to piss off the British. And that's where we find our passionate lover of the sea and adventure, Aristide Aubert du Petit Thouars, who still participates aboard the Tonon in the expedition of 200 ships and 35,000 men who leave Toulon on June 19, 1798. These troop movements seriously worry the English, who do not yet know what the goal of the Corsican general is. When in doubt, they entrust a small fleet to a brilliant and courageous Rear Admiral, Horatio Nelson, a guy who has seen so much that he is missing an eye and an arm. In short, the cripple follows Bonaparte as best he can through the storms and continues to head east. He concludes that the goal of the French expedition is Egypt. Believing he is behind the French, he rushes towards Alexandria, which is indeed Bonaparte's goal. And he passes him without him knowing it. Nelson arrives in Alexandria on June 28th. He obviously does not see the French fleet and sails north towards Anatolia in search of Napoleon. The latter arrived 2 days later on July 1st at Alexandria, where he captured the city the next day, Brillaud. He sent his men to lead the famous Egyptian expedition, while his fleet, too large for the port of Alexandria, went to anchor in the Bay of Aboukir further west. When he learns of the capture of Alexandria from Greece, Nelson must be feeling a little bit stupid, and with reason. And Nelson, he's going to put his rage to the service of the crown. He returns immediately to Alexandria on August 1st. The 13 French ships of the line, including the Tonon, are not there, but he discovered them at Aboukir. Brillaud, leading the French fleet, has clearly not done a good job. These ships are poorly armed, and he has not sent scouts to cover his back. He's therefore surprised by Nelson's sudden arrival and does not prove to be a good strategist to get out of this quagmire. Rather than confronting the enemy on the high seas with more mobility, as the ebullient Aristide advised, Brillaud opted for a united battle line, leaving vulnerable places where Nelson's 13 ships of the line, followed by his 4 frigates, could pass. To top it off, some of his captains did not follow his orders, further weakening his strategy, not to mention that a third of the sailors are ashore looking for supplies. As you can imagine, things got off to a bad start. The battle begins at 6:20 p.m., when the 2 French ships open fire on the British, even though all the French captains are still on board the flagship L'Orient, an engagement that quickly turns into a disaster for the French fleet. Aristide and his crew fight like wild animals. They severely damage an English ship, the HMS Majestic, and then another one, the HMS Bellerophon, is forced to surrender. With the arrival of the British reinforcements, our hero finds himself caught in the crossfire. Under the guns and cannon fire, he gets his foot crushed and his leg broken, even both legs and his arm, according to some sources. This was a mere scratch for Aristide, who nevertheless followed the advice of his officers and went to the infirmary, promising to return soon. Just as he was amputated, Aristide heard the explosion of L'Orient, the flagship, in the distance. And our man is not the type to hide when the rout is near. He doesn't even give the surgeon time to make a solid bandage. And he leaves, as best he can, up to the deck, pissing blood, propped up on a cereal bag to, quote, stand up. Really with quotation marks because without legs. However, the hope of victory is slim, and the ship is drifting. For Aristide, it was the opportunity to leave in style. He and his first mate decide to sacrifice themselves by stopping under fire from 2 English ships, right in line, to protect other French ships. The masts of the Tonon are broken, except for the flagpole, which is holding on as best it can. And while the English, noticing the imminent French defeat everywhere else, ask him to surrender, certifying that he fought more than well, Aristide shows his flag that he had nailed to the rest of the mast, refusing to lower his colors. He encourages his crew to never surrender, screaming at the top of his lungs before passing out and dying. His last order, throw his body into the sea to prevent the English from taking him. The battle was lost, but he became a legend. Well, almost, because during the Napoleonic Wars, there are more than a few who have the opportunity to prove their bravery before dying, so that today, we've forgotten the little guy. But respect, Aristide. We don't forget you. In the epic death genre, there are some who put all the luck on their side. First of all, being a knight, that's not bad. During the 100 Years' War, it's even better, because there are a lot of guys who die. And better than that, being old and blind when you charge the enemy on your horse. Not bad, right? Yep, this is the incredible story of John I of Bohemia, and you'll see it's worth the trip. At the beginning of the 14th century, France was a prosperous country, the most populous in Europe, with fairly flourishing businesses, an immense surface area, and unrivaled power. Its nobles, they're the most formidable fighters, raised in the codes of honor and chivalry. Used to fighting together on horseback, they fight their enemies one by one, preferring to capture them and then exchange them for ransom, a lifestyle that has its advantages. They make a lot of money, and above all, they are less likely to be killed, so everyone is happy. But when it comes to military combat, it's more about individual achievement than collective strategy. Unfortunately, this prosperous period will not last. There is a climatic cooling that affects crops, and population growth threatens to bring back the famine that had disappeared since the 12th century. All of this, plus a great diversity of crops for the culinary pleasure of the richest, creates a shortage of basic products, a drop in prices, a drop in the income of the nobles, and therefore an increase in taxes. No matter the era, it never feels good. The nobles, as well as the king, would therefore prefer a good war. First, because they know it will bring them ransoms, which is worth the basic maintenance cost of the knight, and would gladly arrange them. Second, because in case of war, they have the right to levy exceptional taxes. So the idea occurs to some. Our English friends have a less populated and less rich country. On the military side, they gradually abandoned the classic feudal chivalry, too expensive to maintain, to turn to a modernization of the army, with a more defensive strategy. A conscription of soldiers less rich than nobles, less equipped, but more effective at a distance as archers and crossbowmen. We add to that a policy of riding to plunder the enemy's lands, far and fast. And finally, a light cavalry, just as cheap but fast and efficient. Some say that they have stolen all these techniques from the Scots, who used them successfully against the English during their Second War of Independence. In addition to that, the climate cooling and the population growth at the expense of agricultural land is also valid for them and has even more devastating effects, since they are forced to import more. Typically big consumers of wine, which is much more drinkable than well water, temperature drops prevent them from producing it in the south of the island, as they did in the past, so they have to bring it from the only land they have left in France, the Duchy of Guyenne. And there too they are jealous of the French, who for the last 2 centuries have gradually stripped them of their great Plantagenet empire, Normandy, Poitou, Limousin, Anjou, Aquitaine. They have lost everything and are left with only the thin Duchy of Guyenne on the Atlantic coast. And still, the King of France has authority over it, since the King of England has to pay him tribute as a duke. So on both sides, if there's an excuse to get in each other's faces go through, we wouldn't mind. But it turns out that the French, well, they have a few little succession problems. To make it short, Philippe le Bel died in 1314. Not very serious, he had 3 sons. The eldest, Louis X le Hutin, takes the throne and marries in second marriage Clémence of Hungary, his first wife, Marguerite of Navarre, having been repudiated for infidelity. But poof, Louis dies in 1316. No big deal. Clémence is pregnant and soon gives birth to the new King of France, Jean I, dit le Posthume, because he dies 4 days later. As a result, the heir to the throne became Jeanne de Navarre, the first daughter of Louis and Marguerite, except that the nobles didn't want her, for fear that one day a handsome foreign prince will marry her and become King of France. So, we declare her a bastard and a victor. This will be justified 30 years later by a law that is supposedly very old, but in fact brand new, the Salic Law, so that the crown can be transmitted only by males. It's therefore the brother of Louis X, Philip V the Long, who ascends the throne. But, bam, in 1322, again, he dies without a male child, and it's Charles IV, also Le Bel, who becomes king to die without an heir too, in 1328. It almost looks like the guys passed the message to each other. A situation not so easy. The nobles get together to find a substitute. They have 2 solutions. Either Edward III, King of England, son of the daughter of Philip the Fair, Isabella of France, or Philip of Valois, son of Philip the Fair's brother, Charles of Valois. We end up choosing Philippe, who becomes Philippe VI since he descends from the Capetians by males, while we wonder if Isabella of France can transmit a right to the crown that she herself cannot exercise. In fact, we don't want a foreign king on the throne, like with Jean de Navarre that we saw earlier. So Edward III has it bad, but he doesn't blink, even when he has to come and pay tribute to Philip VI for his Duchy of Guyenne. It's not good for the ego, Philip abuses, but it's just a bad moment to pass. Except that Philippe, he goes too far. And just to piss off his cousin, not only does he support the Scottish nobles who rebel against Edward, but he also insists on the fact that, in Guyenne, he has the last word, which has always annoyed the English. This is too much. Edward has a good heart, but you can't fool around. He takes out his dynastic rights, and a war breaks out on October 7th, 1337. And in itself, not even so much to recover the throne, just to stop him from being bothered with Guyenne. For several years, the conflict will be limited to the peripheries of the 2 kingdoms, Edward feeding the conflict of succession in Brittany, and Philippe the Scottish revolts. But from 1339 on, Edward launches lightning raids on French soil, mainly in Normandy, with a limited but trained army, looting and devastating countless towns and villages at a lightning speed. So much so that the French can hardly catch up with them, and even less protect themselves. But during the English Ride of 1346, which came dangerously close to Paris before retreating northward in the hope of taking Calais or Boulogne, Philippe and his much larger and better equipped army managed to catch up with Edward's army near Crécy, August 26, 1346. On the heights, Edward's 15,000 to 20,000 men are waiting patiently, while down below, Philippe's 50,000 men are jostling each other after a long day of marching under an overwhelming sun. Suddenly, it was a storm. In the front ranks of the French army, Genoese crossbowmen, who, unlike the English archers, do not protect their strings from the rain. Behind them, the cavalry, stomping with impatience at the idea of fighting and, above all, of taking prisoners for ransom. And in the rear, men on foot, exhausted by the march. The battle, which seemed uncertain for the English, was likely to hold surprises for the French. After the storm, the crossbowmen tried to fire, but their wet ropes were too loose. Their flimsy arrows fall only a few meters away, while the well-protected bows of the English take their toll. Edward also decides to use the few cannons he had brought with him to intimidate the cities to be besieged. However, they did not do much damage, but it was a novelty that caused panic by the noise and the flames that they produced, pushing the Genoese to retreat. Embarrassed by these pedestrians, the cavalry, which for the moment is riddled with arrows, ends up slaughtering these same Genoese on the king's orders, just to be able to move on. And at the back, an old knight of about 50 years, blind, while the scene is described to him, soberly declares, "Poor beginning." This knight is the famous John I, King of Bohemia and Count of Luxembourg, born in 1296, a descendant of Louis VI the Fat, thus a distant cousin of the King of France. He is the perfect model of the knight king. In fact, he's even more knight than king. He doesn't administer Bohemia. His wife does. He never sets foot in Bohemia except to collect a little money to finance new military expeditions. Because he's very good at it. An accomplished horseman, a skilled warrior, a good strategist. He fought in France, Lithuania, Italy, Germany, everywhere. And this from a very young age, crossing Europe in search of the smallest battle or showing off his courage and strength. And in terms of chivalry, France, well, there's nothing better, so it's a regular. But then, while playing at the Crusade in Lithuania in 1336, to convert the country to Christianity, he gets an ophthalmia, misses the operation, and becomes blind, which is not really over-practical for fighting. But that doesn't stop him because we find him in Crécy at 50 years old, in armor, on his horse, chained to two other knights in order to be guided despite his blindness, asking specifically to be put in the front line, surrounded by his men. He thus begins the chaotic charge of the French knights who want at all costs to show the pedestrians what it is to fight with honor and bravery. The only advantage is that where everyone is blinded by the sun that the English have behind their backs, he already can't see anything. Well, I know I'm trying to see a little positive in this. You have to be satisfied with a little. So the fine flower of chivalry charges, but does not manage in the melee to pass the English archers, well tightened in their shelter of the hedges which slaughter the horses under the deluges of arrows. And where the French dream of taking prisoners, the English don't care at all. They were far from their base, and to break ranks to go and help a knight to get up was to risk taking one. So they slaughter at all costs until nightfall. No one can see where they shoot or where they hit, which is especially true for old Jean, who slaughters as many friends as enemies with his sword. And personally, I can imagine very well the two guys who help him guide his horse yelling, "Right, John! Well, oh hell, your other right!" Anyway, that's where he'll die, riddled with wounds and surrounded by the corpses he hacked down, included in the long list of victims of this pitiful day that could have gone much differently if Philippe, who cowardly fled, had been a bit more strategic. At least the old John, the same age as the King of France, he did not flee and met a real chivalrous death, which, as you well know, is not incompatible with a stupid death. One of the best ways to make sure you'll be remembered after your death is to create a terrifying legend that will be passed on from generation to generation. Now, the concern is that this may lead to a brutal end, but as they say, no pain, no gain. And that's typically what happened to Edward Thatch, or Teach. Doesn't that tell you anything? It makes sense since it's probably an assumed name. On the other hand, he is better known for a famous physical attribute, which gave him his name. An attribute that I can boast to share a little bit with him. And your mind is really too twisted. I'm talking about Blackbeard, who you must know at least by name. I'm telling you right now, forget Pirates of the Caribbean, Black Sails, or even Assassin's Creed. It will be less bloody, a little more venal, but the ending is just as tasty. It is the early 18th century, the golden age of capitalism and the triangle trade. Never has so much profit been made. Never has there been such a gap between the ordinary sailors or peasants and the wealthy landowners and merchants. Many peasants, ruined and stripped of their land by their creditors or their lords in the face of an increasingly hard and expensive life, embarked as sailors in the Royal or Merchant Navy, for want of anything better, to work in appalling conditions and for low wages. You get desperate guys who eventually become even more desperate. And the result is that you get mega desperate guys who dream of a better world and a sweeter existence. Some people whisper the words mutiny and piracy, but few take the plunge for the moment. Reprisals, even if they're not yet at their peak, are already violent. So many, in the British Royal Navy in particular, are content with their situation, and this one, fortunately, is going to get a little bit better. Well, we have to see how much and what it will cost them because, as you know, what's taken from us on one side is taken back on the other. The War of Spanish Succession broke out in 1701, involving most of the European monarchs, such as France, Spain, the Holy Roman Empire, Austria, Great Britain, and others. And this war was also fought at sea, especially at a time when a lot of resources and wealth were being drawn from the colonies and foreign trade. Sailors became indispensable. We hire many of them. We improve their living conditions a little bit, such as wages and food. In short, they were pampered. They were very happy with this turn of events. Many of them see this as an opportunity to start a career as a privateer, that is, as a sailor on a ship that has the right to strike at its enemies in the name of the crown. A vocation highly encouraged by the powers that be, who see it as a wonderful cheap labor force to go and mess up the neighbor. But all good things come to an end. Thus, in 1713, the two treaties of Utrecht put an end to this war, and if many were happy about it, notably the landowners and merchants, the sailors and privateers, on the other hand, saw it in a bad light. But what do they have? For them, the consequences are dramatic. Their salaries go down, sometimes by half. Their food portions, too. They are mistreated more than before, since they are less needed, and their numbers are also taking a big hit. In 1712, there were 49,860 sailors in the Royal Navy. 2 years later, in 1714, there were only 13,470, almost 3 times less. So I might as well say that all of them found the war more comfortable and sweeter. And since most of them have only known war for the greatest part of their lives, they are determined to continue it. After all, as some of them say, this peace is not really valid since they were not asked. At first, we find ourselves with privateers who are unemployed and continue to attack their former enemies despite the peace. But be careful, they never attack the country they were fighting for. They still call themselves privateers, not pirates. They have principles after all. And it's in this period that we hear for the first time about Ed Thatch. Like many pirates, little is known about him before his breakthrough as a rogue. Some say he was born in Bristol, others in South Carolina, or even possibly in Jamaica around 1680. He may even have come from a fairly well-to-do family, since he could read and write, which was not very common at the time. Arriving in the Caribbean at the end of the 17th century, he became a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, where he seems to have already proven himself before, like so many others, refusing to enter the Navy or Merchant Marines for a pittance. So that's when he became a pirate. And in the early 18th century, there is no better place for a pirate than the island of New Providence, in the Bahamas, with its capital city of Nassau, which is said to have as many as 800 forebaits. Thatch joined the island shortly after 1713, and in 1716 he met Benjamin Hornigold, an already renowned pirate, who took him on board and for whom he quickly became the second in command. Together they scour the seas, and Hornigold quickly entrusts him with a sloop, that is, a small ship on which he gains renown. Shortly after, in November 1716, they captured together La Concorde, a large slave ship of which Thatch was made captain. The enormous ship was the largest of the entire pirate fleet and was renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. And to her 20 cannons, 20 more are added, giving her incredible firepower for a pirate ship that the English are unable to stop. It is at this same period that Thatch leaves Hornigold, judged not pirate enough by his crew, since he refuses to attack British ships full of wealth, under the pretext that he himself is British. What an amateur. Moreover, Hornigold, for the anecdote, accepted a royal pardon and even started hunting pirates afterward. A true social traitor, Thatch finds another partner with whom he will capture nearly 18 ships, Stede Bonnet, who is known as the Gentleman. It is also in these waters that he begins to cultivate his appearance. Thatch, according to the sources we have, is not very inclined to violence. In any case, we know that he doesn't mistreat his prisoners, for example, but that doesn't prevent him from suggesting it in order to persuade the enemy to surrender without fighting, as many pirates preferred. Already very tall and broad-shouldered, with a long, shaggy beard that reaches up to his eyes, he twists it with ribbons and locks that he sometimes lights, wears a big black hat under which he puts burning matches, big knee-high boots, and a big, often red, coat. Thus he begins to be called Blackbeard, and his reputation precedes him more and more, lending him atrocities that he probably never committed. But as expected with all this paraphernalia, many of his prey surrender without a fight. It's all in the staging. He will thus scour the seas, gathering a strong flotilla with which, among other things, he will besiege Charleston, at the time Charlestown, in May 1718, to obtain, among other things, medicines, and thus heal his crew and possibly other pirates, according to some sources. You could almost give him the good Lord in confession to this boy. Anyway, at the height of his power, he ends up beaching the Queen Anne's Revenge on a sandbank. Voluntarily, it seems, because, just like some of the crew members he abandons on small islands, she became a bit too cumbersome for someone wanting to keep a low profile. Because yes, there is a time when our famous pirate settles down and accepts the royal pardon. It's not good for the legend, that's for sure, but it didn't last very long, don't worry. And then, the less we are numerous, the more the shares are juicy. And that, well, I told you it was going to be a bit venal. So he quickly resumes his activities with a smaller crew, but this time more or less legally. Charles Hayden, the governor of North Carolina, a region less rich than its neighbors South Carolina or Virginia, is less careful about the origin of goods and does not hesitate to do business with pirates. So Thatch makes his way, leading his expeditions from the small island of Ocracoke, even marrying the daughter of a planter who was 16 years old, 20 years younger than him. It's hard to imagine how Grandpa Blackbeard can afford an epic death. Don't worry, these exactions covered up by the governor and the judge of North Carolina are too disturbing. Some settlers will complain directly to the governor of Virginia, Alexander Spotswood, who intends to put an end to all of this. He'll therefore take advantage of the passage of two frigates, the Lime and the Pearl, to take the best men, headed by Lieutenant Maynard, and send them to capture or kill the forbidden men in Ocracoke, which is totally out of his jurisdiction since he's not the governor. But he doesn't care. In the face of this new threat, Blackbeard doesn't seem to mind. He's still partying on the beach of Ocracoke with his rather small crew, not even trying to get away. But on the morning of November 21st, 1718, they are surprised by two small sloops entrusted to Maynard, on which they open fire. A broadside is particularly deadly, as Maynard apparently loses about 20 men, or a third of his crew. But in spite of this, Thatch only had about 20 men with him, 25 at the most. The boarding, inevitable since Maynard caught up with the pirate, was bloody. Blackbeard, aboard his ship the Adventure, prefers to take the lead and boards Maynard's sloop, throwing grenades beforehand and rushing in with his last loyal followers. But when they arrive on board, other men emerge from the hold and surround the pirates. They fall into their trap. Seeing the end coming, all fight like lions. Thatch first. His beard and hat smoking thanks to the matches and wicks he conceals, he fires many pistols that he carries with him into battle, sabering and stabbing in turn, even breaking Maynard's sword with his dagger. Wounded many times, he doesn't seem to weaken for all that, swearing like a demon until a saber pierces his throat. He then fights a little more, but assailed from all sides, he finally collapses. Maynard had him decapitated and hung his head from the bowsprit of his ship. But before throwing the body of the damned pirate into the sea, he notices the wounds. The terrible Blackbeard will have received 5 bullets and between 20 and 30 more or less serious cuts. A kind of Chuck Norris of the time, except that Chuck Norris will never die. And that's it, folks. That's the end of this episode. It's a bit of a change from the stupid deaths, and even if sometimes we flirt with the limit between epic and absurd. Anyway, I still have enough to do at least one episode, but if you have any suggestions, put them in the comments and I'll see what I can do. This episode was co-written with Fred from the Hero.com channel. Don't hesitate, check it out, especially if you're a pirate or a Crusader fan. Really, you'll find what you're looking for. Don't forget to subscribe and to activate that little bell so you don't miss the next episodes. Thank you all again for your support, and we'll see you all soon for a new episode of Nota Bene. Bye.